Today, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met in Geneva. Frankly, the two leaders did not expect any kind of breakthrough in their talks, and that's exactly what happened. Another meeting, another round of diplomacy, and no concrete answers to the conflict. Blinken says that any aggression will be met with a swift response, while Lavrov accused the West of not keeping its promises. Basically, the same words, just in a new setting.
Russia has never, nowhere, not a single time, through its official representatives, threatened Ukrainian people. As I told you, it's not the end of our discussions. Next week we will, as Antony Blinken highlighted several times, receive the written response.
From experience, that Russia has an extensive playbook of aggression short of military action, including cyber attacks, paramilitary tactics, and other means of advancing their interests aggressively without overtly using military action. Those types of Russian aggression will also be met with a decisive, calibrated, and again, united response.
Russia has long been insisting for its demands to be taken seriously. The demands include sweeping security guarantees, including a permanent ban on Ukraine joining NATO. This time, Lavrov says that Washington has agreed to provide Russia a written response to its demands. For the United States and its NATO and other European allies, nothing less than a vast pullback of troops works. Something Blinken asked Lavrov to do during the meeting. So what exactly is the current situation? Well, Russia and the United States are talking again, while the country they are discussing is completely left out of the table. Russian troops remain gathered at the Ukrainian border, while the West scrambles to put up a united front. The current conflict between the West and Russia has many layers, and they are all fueled by multiple issues. But at the crux of one conflict is one particular belief. Russia believes that it was betrayed by the West, that the West broke promises made at the end of the Cold War. The promise in question is that NATO would not expand to the east. Putin has long argued that the US broke a crucial promise that it made in 1990, while there are different interpretations on what was promised to the Russian leader then. The Russian president now, Vladimir Putin, has long looked at it as a betrayal. Let's now pull out a map to explain why he thinks so. Here's a map of Europe. The countries marked in yellow are the ones that joined NATO before 1997. This includes the likes of Norway, Germany, Italy, France, Spain and others. But take a look at the countries marked in orange. These are the countries that joined the military alliance after 1997. It includes several Central and East European states that were once a part of the Soviet Union or under its sphere of influence. 4 of them, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, even have borders with Russia. So we get why Russia is worried. If Ukraine joins NATO, then the alliance will be at Russia's gates. But the point is, Ukraine was satisfied with its position a decade ago, but it did not want to join the alliance. But the invasion of Crimea in 2014 has left Ukraine worried. It wants to ensure its security, and joining NATO seems like the best option. As for NATO, the conflict with Russia has sparked its unintentional renewal. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the alliance lacked a meaningful role. The US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 created bitter disputes between several members. The French president even once described NATO as brain dead. But the conflict now has given it renewed purpose, an allied unity in an often fractious organization of 30 member states. Currently, nothing has changed. A 90-minute-long meeting in Geneva was another diplomatic scramble, the latest in the flurry of diplomacy in the region. But will it avert a potentially devastating new war in Europe? Well, only time will tell. Let's now get you some more perspective from both sides of this story that we've been tracking. Joining us live now is Casey Babb, an Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute from Washington, D.C. And also joining us is Fred Weir, a Russian affairs expert from Moscow. Firstly, thank you to both of you for joining us on WION. Now, Casey, I'd like to take my first question from you. What can be said about the U.S. stance in all of this? Blinken clearly stated that the U.S. is committed to the path of diplomacy, yet emphasized that Russian aggression will be met with a swift response. So what do you make of this statement?
Well, look, U.S. statements on this have kind of created this blurry middle ground. And Secretary Blinken, of course, President Biden have tried to sort of reconcile some of those inconsistencies and some of those sort of soft messages that the administration has sent, particularly with President Biden suggesting, a minor incursion may result in a more minor response. So I think right now the U.S. has sort of put themselves in a bit of a tricky situation where they're trying to, make up for those inconsistencies and still send a strong signal to Russia and to other nations throughout the world. But of course, America's deterrent effect has been dramatically reduced over the last decade.
Right. Now, let's get some Russian perspective now. Fred, you join us from Moscow. So how are the Russian foreign minister's remarks being perceived? Russia demands a written response from the U.S., something that Blinken has now agreed to. What do you make of this?
Well, the amazing thing is that this process of diplomacy is continuing. If you listen to the public statements, they are so irreconcilable that you would wonder why they bother. I think that there is a sense that short of World War III, NATO isn't expanding to the east anymore anyway. NATO is, it has created quite a degree of overreach. It's taken in a big swath of Eastern Europe. It's more of an ideological alliance than a practical military one. And this open door policy now threatens it to put it into direct confrontation with a greatly revived Russia. In the 1990s, Russia was prostrate and not able to effectively oppose it. This is a very, very different Russia, and they've drawn this red line in Ukraine. I think there is a deal probably to be made. I think both sides perceive that neither one is going to get what they wish for, but some accumulation of compromises, maybe starting with confidence-building measures, can lead to a more satisfactory outcome. And what the Kremlin probably has in mind is a belt of neutral countries between Russia and NATO. That could include not only Ukraine, Georgia, but also Belarus.
Right.
There is a possibility there of a more stable security order in Europe, and they may be groping toward that.
Right, Fred, that's an interesting point that you made right there. Casey, just to follow up to that, coming back to you, both leaders have made it clear, in fact, they made it clear before the talks that they were not expecting any kind of breakthrough. And that's exactly what happened. More talks are now expected, but will we see tensions going down between Russia and the United States?
Well, that's difficult to say, and it's difficult to say if tensions, increase or decrease, how long that sort of state of affairs will hold. I mean, we have this rather myopic view in the West of, if there's a regime change or if Putin is succeeded by somebody more moderate or somebody more aligned with Western values and ideology, that, these tensions will eventually sort of dissipate and we'll be in a better, more favorable situation with Russia. And I think that's sort of a misguided approach. We need to think more strategically about sort of motivations, the Kremlin's motivations, the siege mentality that has sort of dictated Russian policy over the last several decades, indeed, centuries, and sort of work with our allies and do a bit more reflecting on sort of, well, what do we need to do to have a bit of strategic empathy and understand where our adversaries, in this case the Kremlin, is coming from. I think that will play in our favor over the long term in terms of creating a sustained period of decreased tension. But in terms of what will happen right now with this situation in Ukraine, it's very difficult to say. And I think many observers around the world right now would argue that things are not looking good.
Right, Casey, thanks for those comments. Just wrapping up here, Fred, I'd like to take my final question from you. How do you see the conflict over Ukraine panning out? How much say will Ukraine have in the events going forward? It's been completely left out of these crucial discussions. Now, Russia insists that it has no plans of invading Ukraine, but the West fears otherwise. So how do you see this all panning out?
There is no sign that Russia is preparing to invade Ukraine. They've been moving troops around in provocative ways at the border. They're mostly troops from the Western Military District, some of them not far from their own home bases. They definitely doing this, building field hospitals and kitchens and so on, suggestive of future action, but they've been doing it in plain sight of satellite cameras in order to create this crisis. They definitely did that because they want this conversation and they believe the time for it is now. I really don't think Russia is planning to invade Ukraine. I mean, we live too much with these 1930s analogies. You know, it's been like an endless loop. 1930s over, and every time a crisis emerges, it's like 1938 all over again. And then now soon we'll get the Blitzkrieg. It's not going to be like that. Right. This is not that world. And Russia may well try to destabilize Ukraine. It's a deeply divided country. And there's a lot of things that Russia can do. The one thing you can rely on is that the Russians know Ukraine much, much better than people in Washington do. They know where the pressure points are. They can expand separatism, subversion, stage coups d'etats. There's a lot they can do and probably will do if the West and Russia come to some kind of big agreement about it, mainly, I think, at core, Ukrainian neutrality, I think this can be dialed back and we can get a much safer world.
Right. Fred Weir from Moscow and Casey Babb from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us on WION Fine Print at this hour, and thank you for all your insights.
Thank you.
WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.